Hello, everybody. For those of you who've just joined, I'll reiterate our welcome. Thanks to everybody who's already posted in the chat. We are going to get underway now with the webinar. My name is Tom Green. I'm the EdReports Managing Director of Marketing and Communications. Pleasure to be here today with you all on this webinar. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our panelists who we'll be introducing shortly. Just before we fully kick off, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping notes here. So, as many of you have already done, if you haven't already, please do introduce yourself in the chat with your name, organization, and location. A few other things. First of all attendees, you are in listen-only mode here on Zoom, so you don't need to worry about accidentally unmuting yourself or anything like that, at least if we've set it up right. But please do use the chat to add to the discussion as you're already doing. And we also have a Q&A box that you should have access to in Zoom where you can ask questions, and we will aim to respond to as many of those as we can over the course of the webinar. We are recording this webinar. I saw somebody asked about that in the chat already. Yes, it is being recorded, and we will be sharing it after the session. That'll likely be early next week once we've got all of our post-production ducks in a row. But look out for that. Speaking of the end of the webinar, which is a little strange on the welcome slide, but nevertheless, here it is. We will be sharing an evaluation survey, a very brief survey at the end of the webinar. We'd love to know what you think. So we'll get that plug in early, and we will reiterate it a few times as we go on. But yeah, please do share your feedback with us at the end. And thank you all. Thanks for being here today and attending. Let's move on to the next slide. Thank you very much. Slide master. Our webinar is called Beyond Selection, Rethinking How Districts Adopt Curriculum, co-presented by the Decision Lab and EdReports. That's also the title of a joint report that we just released last month, which some of you I'm sure have seen already. More about that report over the course of the webinar. Let's move on to the next slide, please, and talk about the webinar objectives. So today we will be examining the evolving landscape of instructional materials adoption, including the conditions, constraints, and opportunities shaping how districts select and implement high-quality curricula. We're also going to be discussing key insights from that report I just mentioned, Beyond Selection, same name as the webinar, and we'll be focusing on what the findings reveal about the people, process, and policy challenges in managing curriculum change. Finally, we will be identifying actionable strategies and partnerships that help states, districts, and supporting organizations to strengthen alignment between policy process and classroom practice to improve student learning outcomes. That's what it's all about ultimately. All right, those were our objectives. We've mentioned this report briefly already. This is the full report that we published and co-authored between EdReports and the Decision Lab that came out last month. Features insights from over 250 district leaders and educators that we surveyed together, and reveals what drives and hinders effective adoption of high quality instructional materials. That's also what we'll be discussing in today's webinar, of course. And there is a QR code if you want to pull it up right away and bookmark it, or you can obviously just go to the EdReports website, edreports.org/resources, and you'll be able to find it there too. And we'll also be sharing it in that sort of post-webinar email with the recording and various other supporting resources. So look out for that. That's the report, and here's our agenda. We will be kicking off. We've sort of kicked off already, but kicking off in another way with introductions shortly. After that, we will do a quick survey of the curriculum adoption and implementation landscape and the findings of our report. Then we'll have a facilitated discussion session and an audience Q&A. So, get those questions ready. Finally, there's another plug for that feedback survey. That'll be coming at the end, so please do that. All right, I would love to introduce our panelists now. So I'm very excited today on the panel for this webinar today. We've got Teresa Eliopoulos, who works with me here at EdReports. Hello, Teresa, our policy and strategy lead. I'm going to hand over to all the panelists to sort of introduce themselves in more depth and tell you more about what they do shortly. So don't worry, you'll be hearing from them. We also very excited to welcome Dr. Maraki Kebede, who's the education lead at the Decision Lab, and Sophie Cleff, who is a consultant at the Decision Lab as well. And then that's me, Tom Green, Managing Director of Marketing and Communications at EdReports. I'm your host today. Me and the panelists, welcome. So let's move on to our next slide. I'll introduce EdReports. I'm sure many of you who've joined are pretty familiar with us, but as a refresher, this is our mission statement at EdReports. We're an independent nonprofit designed to improve pre-K through 12 education. The P there is a fairly recent addition. We've mostly historically focused on K through 12, but expanding into pre-K now. We have those first reviews, underway. First reports slated for next year. So that's an exciting development. And at EdReports, we're all about increasing the capacity of teachers, administrators, and leaders to seek, identify, and demand the highest quality instructional materials. We draw upon expert educators. Our reviews are by educator, for educator, and those reviews of instructional materials and our support of smart adoption processes, which is a lot of what we'll be talking about today. Those are the ways we aim to help equip teachers with excellent materials nationwide. So that's what EdReports is all about. A little bit about our impact. You can see here that EdReports has achieved quite a lot. Over 10 years, we actually celebrated our 10th anniversary this year. This March is when we marked it. Still celebrating it now. And over that last decade, we have seen incredible growth in the reach and influence of high quality instructional materials. Started out with just a few early partners, and now we're proud to say it's over, thousands of districts, millions of students across the country. Our reviews have shaped decisions in over 120 of the largest school districts and informed state policies in 31 states and counting. But beyond those numbers, the real story is about raising the bar on what students and teachers should expect from instructional materials. On that note, we're also proud that more than 40 publishers have improved their materials in response to our reviews, as that stat shows at the bottom left. That speaks to a market that's listening and evolving towards higher standards for all students. Now, the first chapter of our work over those first 10 years has focused very much on increasing the availability and selection of high quality materials. Now, as we're looking ahead to the future, the next 10 years and beyond, we see ourselves entering a even more critical phase, helping ensure those materials are actually used well in classrooms to support better outcomes for students, in addition to being selected in the first place. So improved curriculum is just the beginning. We know that impact happens when materials are implemented with integrity, backed by strong teacher support, and embedded in a coherent instructional vision. So that's the challenge and opportunity ahead as we see it. All right, that is an introduction to EdReports. I'm now going to hand over to Maraki to introduce the Decision Lab.
Thanks so much, Tom. And hello, everyone. As Tom mentioned, my name's Maraki. I'm the education lead at the Decision Lab. We're a research and innovation firm. We work to support better decision making for social impact. And our mission is to democratize behavioral science. So, as human beings, we're all inundated with tens of thousands of decisions a day, and not all of them serve us well, right? Whether it's individually or collectively. And so, as a field, what behavioral science allows us to do is to systematically study how people make decisions. And we're not rational beings, but irrational decisions aren't random, right? So they follow some sort of predictable pattern. So because our brains are sort of wired to process information efficiently rather than perfectly. So what we do is kind of conduct a lot of research and experimentation in order to kind of address some of these heuristics. While they can be useful for everyday survival, they can also lead to a lot of systemic errors and judgments. So across various sectors, education being a pillar one, our work is really trying to understand decision making and also make sure that we're making decisions that actually serve us well. So in the next slide, you'll see our work specifically in the education sector. In the US education sector, we've been working with the support of the Gates Foundation to empower the HQIM ecosystem. And for us, this includes core curriculum as well as sort of ed tech and curriculum aligned professional learning. And we do this through our K-12 Market Signals Studio, and we have a link to this at the end of the webinar if you're looking to access that. Our sort of theory of change focuses on shifting the onus away from school districts, since many education initiatives, as many of you in this room probably know, unintentionally add more work to already stretched teams that we're trying to support. So our sort of theory of change is really trying to first understand how school districts make decisions around procurement. So we do this through our research and experimentation, and then informing and building the capacity of support organizations like EdReports to ultimately drive HQIM adoption more effectively.
Thanks very much, Maraki. Just remembering to unmute myself there. Thanks, and again, welcome to all of our panelists. You'll be hearing from Teresa and Sophie shortly too. Just before we get into the sort of entree main section of our webinar, I want to give a sort of overview of some of the key themes that we're going to be exploring and unpacking in today's session. So when we think about, the landscape and the findings of the report, a few key things we want to highlight are first, that curriculum selection is fundamentally a human behavior issue. That's the sort of connection between our two organizations in this work. And that's what we really want to highlight and kind of bring together here. There's a lot of agreement in the field these days that quality curriculum matters more than there used to be, but there are still behavioral and structural barriers to identifying and adopting those materials in every district. And so by applying this kind of behavioral science lens towards district decision making, that helps us highlight that first, districts do value high quality materials. There's no question about that. But the struggle can come with reconciling stakeholder priorities and getting stakeholders engaged in that selection and implementation process. Another key theme we're going to be highlighting for you all today is that districts do clearly value and need external support in adopting and implementing curriculum. And we'll be looking at some of the ways how they think about priorities currently according to our survey results, and some potential opportunities for other ways, other approaches that we want to encourage folks to think about. So that's our overall framing. I'm now going to hand over to Sophie to talk about why humans struggle with change. Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you, Tom, and hello, everybody. So we wanted to dig a little bit deeper and to show everyone the kind of lens that we tend to use as behavioral scientists at the Decision Lab when we are examining behaviors like the adoption of high-quality instructional materials. So we're always approaching research with a cognitive science lens, and there are many different frameworks that describe human behavior and motivation that we use in our research, some of which were built by other people, some of which are bespoke. But the one that's described on this slide, which is COM-B, standing for capability, opportunity, motivation, and behavior, was the basis for much of the research that went into the Beyond Selection paper. So as Maraki mentioned, we take a lot of mental shortcuts when we make decisions, and often this can lead to biases and heuristic that make the outcomes imperfect, let's say. But foundational frameworks and tools like this one kind of help us zero in on what is actually the behavior that needs to occur and what's preventing that behavior from occurring. So for instance, in the case of HQIM adoption, capability might be, are there funds available to adopt a new curriculum? Opportunity might be, is there a curriculum adoption committee that is assembled? Is there space within the school district to perform these duties? And motivation might be, is there availability for at the individual level of the people in the adoption committee to actually participate in this work on top of their regular duties? So in terms of our methods, we gathered 253 high-quality responses from both the Decision Lab's database of district leaders who participate in decision-making around core curriculum adoption, as well as EdReports newsletter recipients. So the survey was designed with COM-B in mind and sort of as one of the foundational frameworks in terms of how we design the questions and also in terms of how we interpret results to try and understand what kind of biases as well as external environmental constraints come into play when district leaders are making decisions around adopting instructional materials.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Teresa Eliopoulos from EdReports. And so jumping into kind of anchoring this in the context of today, let's start a little bit with why this work matters. So on average, states and districts adopt instructional materials only once every 5 to 7 years. And so that means that these are generational decisions that impact an entire cohort of students. And these students spend their formative years with these set of materials that are adopted. And so when we talk about instructional materials and the importance of adoption, it's not just about procurement, it's this high stakes decision that has a ripple effect for the entire educational system. Next slide, please, Tom. And as we've discussed here, we've seen a steady increase in the availability of high quality instructional materials, and Tom highlighted this in some of his intro slides. But about half of all ELA and math curriculum now meet EdReports expectations. But even with that progress, we are seeing through a national survey, only about a third of teachers report actually using those aligned materials in their classrooms each week. And so this gap is telling us something really important, that the problem isn't necessarily the availability of quality materials. There's this friction that exists in the system and behaviors around materials adoption. And that's what led us into really delving into this research to figure out where that disconnect happens. And so if we think about the players in the process, namely districts and teachers, and think about the problems that they face, districts have competing priorities, limited time and resources, and uneven support for structured adoption processes. And then teachers many times can have limited voice early on, which can make things like buy-in and implementation harder. And then add on top of that, places in certain states that have state regulations and requirements, there's an additional layer of complexity that influences when and how adoption happens. And so while the materials themselves are improving, there's this human and organizational systems piece that helps districts select and implement the materials that we are finding is still kind of playing catch up. And so this is why we're framing this curriculum adoption, not necessarily just as this individual purchasing decision, but as an entire change management process. So it's about shifting habits and structures and incentives, not just picking the right product. So let's dig into a little bit of the data that we found in our report. And so if you'd shift to the next slide, kicking it off with some good news. Our survey found widespread agreement among district leaders that high quality instructional materials matter and that their district uses clear criteria to identify quality. So the issue here isn't awareness or belief. The data is pretty clear that the districts value high quality instructional materials, but the widespread consensus from district leaders around this importance of materials and the key criteria for quality promotes this promising foundation for us to build upon. And so the challenge that we're facing here is moving from consensus around the importance of high quality materials to consistent and sustained use. And so that is the bridge that we need to build. Next slide, please. And that bridge is pretty hard to cross, right? At EdReports, we think about adoption as a process, and it's more than just the discrete selection of materials. It spans from the preparation of the process itself to determining local needs and priorities, evaluating materials, narrowing choices, and making the decision. But it doesn't end at that decision. We then move into the implementation phase. And so in this survey, we focused on asking folks, where in this broader process do you experience the greatest challenges or roadblocks? And you can see here that districts are really struggling in the later phases of adoption, nearly half of districts highlighting consensus building as their single biggest challenge followed pretty closely by implementation. And so, interestingly enough, activities like defining district needs or making that final decision rank much lower. So, it's not that districts don't know what they want, it's that aligning people around that vision and sustaining it through implementation is the toughest lift. And so, that points us right back to that change management piece that Sophie was talking about, building trust, ownership, and shared purpose across teachers and leaders and communities. So shifting to that next slide, we start to see a tension in the data because we also asked districts to rank challenges in the adoption process from their most critical to the least critical. And we found that while districts are self-reporting challenges in the late stage activities around stakeholder buy-in and implementation, they are also identifying some early stage infrastructure and compliance work as some of their most critical priorities. So we see this as a real opportunity for districts to understand this data and focus on foundational planning to set up success in the earlier stages. Because while these may seem like logistical concerns, they're actually deeply strategic. And when these foundational items aren't addressed early, they become roadblocks later on. And it's another reminder that successful adoption starts kind of long before materials are chosen. So shifting to this next slide, and I know I'm going through this quickly, but we really want to get into the meat of the discussion. So here, this is really where we see that confidence gap start to appear. So about 72% of leaders say that they're confident in their district's ability to select the right materials, but you'll see far fewer have systems in place to evaluate how those materials are working once adopted. And so only about 60% pilot curriculum before adoption, and just 59% have a process to assess efficacy during implementation. And the biggest thing to note there is less than 20% strongly agree that they have that process. So that's like setting out on a long journey without a way to check your progress. And it really limits the ability to course correct or scale what's working. So if we shift to that next slide, the last thing we asked districts were where they'd most value external support. And the top answers weren't surprising, right? They want help with the process. More than half said they would welcome support in collecting or interpreting data, and significant numbers point to the evaluation and implementation pieces. And when it comes to decision making, districts, of course, want to maintain control. And so this tells us that districts don't actually want someone else to make the choice for them. They want a partner who helps them make that process stronger. And so it's a powerful insight for both providers and for district leaders. The goal here isn't to lead the work for the districts, but instead to build that capacity for district leaders to lead it well. So this was a very brief summary of the data. I hope you really dig into the report to learn more, but I'll turn it back to Tom so we can get into the discussion.
Thanks very much, Teresa. Yeah, and just quickly recapping again those key themes. I won't go through the whole thing again, but curriculum selection really fundamentally being a human behavior issue. That's what we've already explored a little bit in some of that data, and we're going to do more in this upcoming discussion. So, producer Alexis, I think we can take down the slides. Thank you very much. Alexis Gentry, our producer there. Thank you. Let's move into some discussion. Panelists, thank you again for being here today. Thank you for presenting everything so far. One thing I'd love to dig into first is around the people side of change. We saw, actually, quick note from our producer, now's the time for our audience poll. That's right. I've jumped ahead. Audience, we would love to hear from you. We have a little poll. It's not the end of webinar survey, that's still coming. But please do take a quick look at this poll. Let us know which of these sort of challenges resonates most with you. We've got some votes coming in. Give everyone a minute or so to read and vote. Thank you very much for everyone who's voted so far. It seems like implementation is really running away there as the winner in terms of resonating the most, although building consensus getting a lot of I was going to say getting a lot of love, but perhaps it isn't getting enough love. That's what you're all highlighting here. A few votes for the other ones as well. Thank you very much, everybody. I will now go back to our panelist discussion section. So let's see. Oh, there we go. I think the poll, we should be able to hide the poll now. Yeah. Thank you for participating, everybody. So yeah, we were going to talk about the people side of change. We saw that nearly half of districts cite consensus building as their top challenge. That was one of those that came up in the poll just then as well. Teresa, I'd love to come to you first. We see from the report that that buy-in is one of the biggest hurdles. Why do you think consensus is so hard to achieve, even when there's alignment on the value of quality materials?
Thanks, Tom. It's an interesting question, and it was really fun to see those poll results here mimic what we found in our survey and wrote about in the paper. And I think aligning on what matters, right, doesn't automatically translate into the how to get there. And so most district leaders, as we saw, deeply value high quality instructional materials, but they're navigating through these different priorities, and therefore tend to sometimes rush through a broader process. And so this consensus piece is hard because it's not just about the materials. It's about curriculum as teacher identity, right? It's trust, and teachers see curriculum as that reflection of their professionalism. Families involved in the process can see it as a reflection of their values, and administrators can see it as a reflection of their leadership. So there's all these different stakeholders involved. And when everyone agrees, well, everyone agrees like quality matters, it takes time for that intentional communication to create this shared ownership of why a specific choice could be the right one. And so we've seen that this early teacher involvement can build key things, right? Better fit and stronger ownership. And so when teachers participate in setting an instructional vision and analyzing local data and identifying local priorities, the selected materials are more likely to align with their classroom realities and therefore their practical insights. And this makes the selection process more realistic and meet the needs of that local population better. So because these teachers helped to make the decision, they're really invested in making the materials work in their classroom. And so if we think back to the data in the report, right, about half of the districts cite consensus as this big challenge. And these are often ones where that teacher voice comes in too late. And so when teachers are there to help shape that process from the start, that buy-in becomes a byproduct rather than an afterthought. And so that's a really important piece of the puzzle. And so we want to make sure that we are continuing to communicate, right, to invite your stakeholders in early to give everyone that ownership piece.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. That really resonates. That there's a win-win from that early stakeholder engagement. You're both benefiting from the educator expertise and also starting to build buy-in, build investment early on. Maraki, a related question again on the people side of change management as it relates to curriculum adoption. We saw in the report that districts said they value help with like external help with communicating decisions effectively to stakeholders over, say, technical expertise in evaluating curriculum. But what does the data suggest to us about where that change management approach might be breaking down in terms of stakeholder engagement?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think that's, I'm going to echo what Teresa was just saying. I think, there's something to be said about, this being a result of the decision itself, or it could be a result of how the decision is reached, or it could be a result of how the decision is communicated, right? But our work, both in terms of the work we're doing with EdReports, but also all the other district buyer research we've done at TDL, really it's the really interesting piece is the teacher experience, what we're hearing from teachers. And a lot of them actually feel that they're not adequately informed or involved in the curriculum decisions of their district. So even in instances where district leaders are feeling like they're engaging teachers, the way in which they're engaging them might not be ideal. And so that has huge implications for that buy-in element that Teresa was just saying, and ultimately for like the successful adoption and implementation of these quality products. So if you imagine teachers being asked to implement something that they didn't have a say in that approach, or they didn't have a say in the why of that selection, it kind of damages their sense of ownership. And I think that's really where things break down.
Yeah, thank you, Maraki, and thanks Jody in the chat, echoing some of those themes as well, and the importance around, trust between stakeholders, respect for one another. Really appreciate that. Let's shift focus a little and think about like the foundations for change in an adoption and implementation process. That sort of creating those conditions for change. One piece that we highlighted in the slides a little while ago is that we saw a lot of respondents ranking technology infrastructure and compatibility as a big challenge, and regulatory compliance as well, to both, pretty weighty things that come up early in the process. And we also saw that implementation was a big struggle, which is, all else equal is later in the process, post selection. Sophie, I'd love to come to you to ask about how those early and late stages relate. We know we see that implementation is an area of challenge, um, but we also see that maybe those challenges might originate in some of those earlier stages if kind of readiness work is being skipped or is being compressed, things like that. What what does the data tell us about how districts are approaching that whole change process and the sequencing?
Thank you, Tom. Um, Despite the shift in gears of topic towards foundations for change, I think this still relates to what Maraki and Teresa were just sharing about consensus building at the beginning. Because, of course, needless to say, implementation can be a challenge no matter what happens preceding it, early in the earlier stages of the process. But if districts get to the point of implementation and teachers are saying at the point when it's too late that the curriculum that has been adopted does not meet the needs of them or their classroom or the students in their classroom, we can look back to those upstream moments in the adoption process and think about what appropriate engagement of all stakeholders really means, of engaging teachers and everyone who needs to be engaged in building the instructional vision and in determining the district's needs and priorities, which we saw were not ranked as high challenges. But if we consider the challenges that are faced later on in the adoption process, we might think that maybe not all voices are appropriately present in determining the district's needs and priorities if the curriculum that is ultimately selected doesn't fit those priorities. And from the behavioral science side, there are 1,000,001 biases and heuristics that come into these kinds of decisions. For instance, one is the false consensus effect, which is how people tend to overestimate how much others share their beliefs and values. So district leaders might assume that everyone else in the district agrees with them or that teachers agree with them, but we don't know until we ask or until their people are appropriately involved. But of course, there's also the external material constraints that come into this too. Involving everyone at the beginning of the process is really challenging, and compressing these earlier phases of adoption might happen because of trying to meet timeline pressures and the tight schedules of stakeholders involved. So there's a lot that goes into the challenges that come with appropriately sequencing the change and giving each phase the time and resources that it needs.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. I really appreciate that shout out and reminder that we're talking about lots of ways we see from the data and from our learnings about the field, recommendations for things districts can consider, but we also appreciate that they're facing very real constraints around time and around resources, and there's a lot of factors to consider. Um, Maraki, I'd love to come to you with one more related question. For the decision lab, your kind of lens around behavioral science often focuses on reducing friction in decision making. How might that apply to districts navigating complex, regulatory and technical environments, for example?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. We hear that a lot. I mean, so in behavioral science, friction refers to barriers, right? And we talk about barriers as being anything that's kind of preventing you from being able to achieve that target behavior. barriers could be big, barriers could be small, but ultimately they also can cumulatively increase the kind of cognitive load that we experience. So when you're adding complexity, no matter what kind, to the district environment, and these are school districts that are already inundated with, Sophie was just talking about cognitive biases, when they're selecting materials, they might be dealing with, choice overload, or there's a lot of kind of biases that they're already navigating as a result of an already complicated environment. So adding to that, kind of these frictions can compound. So school districts will then become less likely to make more rational decisions. So I think these complexities can only make it more difficult for school districts to make decisions that better serve them.
Yeah, thank you. There are no easy answers, certainly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On when we think about kind of sustaining change, then like moving forward to like, you've selected materials. Hopefully, you've been able to lay some of that groundwork in advance. But we know that, again, we've seen in the report a lot of districts said they struggle with implementation, but we also saw that a little less than 60% said they evaluate curriculum efficacy after adoption. So there's a, potential opportunity there. Teresa, I'd love to hear from you on this one. One of our analysis suggests that, in some cases there could be a sort of confidence implementation gap where from some respondents, we heard a lot of confidence around being able to choose good materials, quality materials, but then not necessarily pairing that with systems to measure and sustain success in implementation. So what does effective implementation planning look like from day one?
Sure. And so I think it's a great question. And effective implementation planning should start before selection is even made. It should be planned for in that really early part of the process, and really think about what is the first day of classroom use and then plan backward from there, right? So that means thinking about asking early some of those tough questions. How are we going to pilot and collect feedback? What professional learning will our teachers need, and how is that going to be embedded within the curriculum? How will we measure success beyond compliance, right? Are our students engaging differently? Are our teachers being supported? And so building on that statistic, around only 60% of districts have these processes in place to evaluate efficacy. It's a huge opportunity, right? And so thinking about how to build those systems in from the start can transform implementation from this one-time rollout to a broader continuous improvement process. And so it could be something simple, right? Scheduled teacher feedback cycles, data check-ins, analyzing different pieces of student work. I think thinking about it in these small, more manageable steps and then building it back into that bigger process is will make it a little bit more manageable. But the biggest thing is really planning for use, and not just focusing on selecting that set of materials and making that choice. It's thinking a bit about it in that bigger context of the broader process.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa. Lots of great ideas and things to chew on there. Just in case everyone feels like they're frantically making notes and trying to capture everything. Well, first of all, we'll share the recording, but EdReports, we also have an adoption guide, our 6 adoption steps on our website that outlines a lot of these types of things as well. So that's another resource that can help here. Before we go, we're going to open up to take some audience questions shortly. Just before we do that, I wanted to touch on the topic of kind of external support and partnerships. We saw in one of those slides that districts, really want to retain decision authority around materials, but they're pretty open to help with things like data and with evaluating materials, with implementation support. So Maraki, I'd love to hear from you for external providers or supporters, whether that's states or nonprofits or other kind of intermediary organizations. It seems like there's an opportunity for them to present themselves as or position themselves as change capacity builders as opposed to like decision influencers, which again, that's more what school systems want to keep in their wheelhouse. So how can those types of supporting organizations position themselves in that way as a change capacity builder?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love this question so much. And I think there's probably many ways to answer this, Tom. But I think based on what we've been seeing in our data and also in the conversations we've been having with a lot of organizations that are trying to support these shifts, I would say it's perhaps shifting their focus away from enforcing and more towards kind of enabling. Behavioral economists talk about choice architecture, which is the practice of designing the way options are presented to people because that can influence their decisions. So, like the context, the order, the framing of choices can significantly shift our behavior. And so, if states were to focus less on what districts should choose and more on how they can choose better on their own, we might see more sustainable shifts because people are more receptive to guidance when it's framed as enabling agency rather than enforcing choices. So it's a big framing kind of approach.
Yeah, that's really important. Thank you very much, Maraki. I'm thinking about, I know in the report, we look at Rhode Island as one example of a state who put that type of approach into action, try to like do a lot of that empowering and enabling of agency. And I'm sure there are many other examples too. Um, I would love now for us to shift focus and answer some audience questions. So thank you very much to everyone who submitted questions when you registered. That was one of the options. I know folks are submitting questions live too. So we're going to get to some of both of those. First one I want to go to is one we got in advance. I don't have a name for this one, so apologies. Please raise your hand or take credit if this was your question. But we really like this one. Teresa, I'll start with you on this one, but panelists feel free to jump in. Um, how do we help districts and schools acknowledge the barriers to implementation, around whether it's things like buy-in or infrastructure, um, to drive more effective alignment and implementation?
That is a great question. And I think it's one of the biggest themes from the report, right? That most implementation challenges are actually not surprises, they are predictable. And so the data show, right, all of these districts are struggling with similar things around consensus building and implementation. Um, and so I think the issue here is that some of these barriers up front are invisible, right? They often go either unacknowledged or unaddressed early enough in the process. And so when we think about the broader framework and thinking about kind of mapping out your adoption process, this will give structure, right, for naming and planning some of those barriers before they can derail implementation. So, for example, in establishing the process, we think about encouraging districts to define your roles, have decision making structures, communication plans, and so that's how you can start to get ahead of some of that buy-in challenge. It's about transparency, yes, but it's also about ownership and making sure that that ownership is really built up from a broad variety of stakeholders. And so then when we think about identifying local priorities, having and building, thinking about infrastructure and technology and policy conditions, when districts take the time to step back and address things that can challenge their capacity, they can design timelines that are realistic and hopefully sequenced for success based on the real challenges that they have. And so we see that by districts bringing teachers and leaders into kind of these early steps, it helps to surface these barriers faster. It creates shared responsibility for solving them. And that's when sort of this alignment and this consensus building can really start to take ground, not because those barriers go away per se, but because everyone understands them and can plan around them more together. And so I think like normalizing the barriers as a part of the process, going into it knowing that you have barriers to address, is really important because you're not going to eliminate every challenge, but if you make them visible and you make them visible early on and you bring folks into the fold, that's enough to help kind of drive the process and drive that response.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. There's maybe a win-win-win going back to a third potential win there in terms of like identifying those issues earlier on in the process with more heads. Um, actually, I'm going to try and do a 2-for-1 now because we did have one uh, advanced question which I really liked, which is what do you do with teachers who refuse to use a resource, meaning the curriculum, I think, in this case. And we've also got a sort of somewhat related question from Joe in the chat or in the Q&A box. Thanks very much, Joe. Um, Question about aligning vision and getting buy-in. Joe's is phrased much more diplomatically, but decades of math education research shows the importance of problem-based learning. But this might be new or different for teachers used to direct instruction, and families might view this as some weird new math. How can district leaders help expand stakeholders' vision of what math class can look like? And perhaps, if you don't mind, Joe, we can also extrapolate that to like what quality instruction, quality materials look like for any subject potentially. So, um, Maraki, Sophie, I'd love to hear from you on this general theme around like getting educator and stakeholder buy-in on the materials in particular.
Sure, I can jump in and then so maybe you can follow in. I think, Tom, and I don't know if you were, it's because you were reading the question or that was paraphrasing that you did, but when we think about teachers refusing to use materials, I think it's important to unpack that a little bit. I think earlier in our presentation, Sophie mentioned the COMBI framework, which has really helped us kind of design resources to support HQIM adoption. But I think what that framework allows us to do is better understand the teacher's reality. So their refusing to use can stem from a lot of different things. And actually in various districts, we've seen it play out in different ways. Sometimes it might be that they don't find it is relevant to their context, or sometimes it might be that maybe they were involved in the selection committee, but they had filled something out in the rubric that wasn't taken into account. So they don't feel, so it really goes back to a lot of these kind of broader structural things that we've been discussing throughout this webinar. I think when a teacher is not using a resource, it might not be that they're simply refusing. It might be that there are other constraints at play. So I think it's really important that we frame these questions also in a way that can help us get at the actual answer, because it could be that they're not refusing. It could be a process that, at least from our experience, sometimes it stems from the way in which they've been involved in the process, or it could stem from other structural things. By that, I mean, bandwidth to shift from their status quo. So we call that status quo bias, like they have a hard time shifting from what they've been doing. And they don't have, time or resources to support them to make that shift. So I think asking the question in that way can not only help us get more accurate answers, but can help us get answers that can actually result in more optimal solutions. So if I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I will add, because also in the question we received in the Q&A, it talks not just about teachers but also about other stakeholders, like families, parents, for instance. And what we found at the Decision Lab and some previous research that we've done is, the power in building trust through showcasing benevolence and competence. I think it's easy to forget in the craziness of the day and age that we're largely aligned. People in education are largely aligned on what matters. Like Tom said at the beginning, student outcomes is really the bottom line that most people are thinking about when they're making these decisions. And it's easy to get lost in the sea of information and emotions that comes with adopting a new curriculum, but emphasizing not only to teachers, but especially to families and other stakeholders that the district is not a malevolent entity, that it is a benevolent entity doing its best to make decisions that are best for students is something that shouldn't be underestimated as well.
And
Yeah,
I
and I
think,
guess,
can
sorry,
I
go
add
ahead,
just
Teresa.
one
Yes, please
small
do, please
piece?
do.
Well, I think just, and I've heard Sophie and Maraki say this, and I just want to turn it into like a one sentence, plain language of, if we treat this as sort of a shared learning journey, right? Rather than a top-down approach where teachers are feeling like something is being done to them rather than working together, right? I feel like this buy-in grows naturally. And I think building on the math question that I saw come in, we're not abandoning what folks have already done, and we're not asking folks to do that. We're I think it's when districts are looking at new curriculum, you're building upon what is already there, right? And so, working with expertise that's in the room for teachers, district leadership that has really strong expertise in curriculum and instruction, they're thinking about how can we take the expertise that we have and improve it and make it even better, not let's just get rid of everything that we've been doing and start again and have that kind of decision fatigue. So I just wanted to highlight that piece.
Thank you very much, Teresa. And then we've got time for one final question, I think, from I've missed who submitted this, so apologies. But great question we'd love to answer is wait, it just jumped away from me in the chat. There we go. How can we get broad buy-in in large districts with hundreds or thousands of teachers? I'm going to open that to the panelists. Anybody who's got a strong opinion about that one.
I mean, I can start and then I hope someone jumps in, but I think it's about scale and size, right? I understand how it would be, um, theoretically easy to work with smaller groups of teachers. But the great thing about large districts with large teachers is sometimes there's really strong infrastructure. There's a teacher leader system. There's a lot of things in place that can really help. And I'd really like to highlight, actually, Eric just popped it in the chat. Baltimore is a really large district that really centered their work around stakeholder buy-in and really focusing on that part of the work. And so with, I know, limited time, I really encourage folks, if you are facing that challenge, Eric did just pop the case study there on how they did a really good job with that larger population around stakeholder buy-in.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Teresa. Go ahead, Sophie.
Thanks, Tom. I'll just add that I think it's important to keep in mind that, in a district of hundreds of thousands of teachers, you won't be able to please everybody and keep expectations realistic, but people respond to numbers. And so I think having a really clear explanation for in the instance of curriculum adoption, showing teachers and other stakeholders the rubric that you've used to make your decision, showing that it was a clearly thought out and as a decision that was as objective as possible, with referring to statistics, referring to any, hard illustration of student success, and very specific reasoning factors related to the qualities of the curriculum that showcase why they feel it was a good decision for the district. Even, external research showcasing, why curriculums of a certain type are better for large districts, or why curriculums of a certain type are best for the student demographics that exist in your district. So falling back to those that sort of numbers don't lie mentality as much as possible can also be really helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie. A shout out for showing your work there as well. We're going to end the Q&A section on there. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted questions. I know we didn't get to all of them live, most of them thanks to Eric and Jana who've been answering, and Maraki as well, who've been answering in the Q&A box. So really appreciate you all who've dropped in and are engaged and asked questions. Before we wrap up today, I'd like to very quickly resume the slides. Alexis, thank you very much, producer Alexis. We would love to flag some resources with you all. These will be in the post-webinar email as well. So these are some key supporting links that we've either referenced today or that are highly relevant to what we've been talking about from both of our organizations. As I said, those will be in the email, but in case anybody wants to screenshot that quickly now, if you can't wait, or Google those links, we recommend checking all of those out to learn more about these topics of, curriculum selection, behavioral science, and how they intersect. Also, on the next slide, please, or maybe that's me. Yeah, there we go. Thanks, Alexis. Next slide. Please do connect with us. We are online on all these various channels and handles, both EdReports and the Decision Lab. So this is where you can find us. You can always Google us too, obviously, but or other search engines are available. But yeah, we would love to hear from you. If you enjoyed the webinar, please do give us a shout out, let us know. And just before we go, don't forget, it's that wonderful exit survey. There's a link coming shortly in the chat, I believe. Oh, it's already there. Thank you very much, Jana. It's a scroll up a little bit. It's there. There's also a bit.ly link if you feel emboldened to type it, and a QR code. But we would love to know what you think. Please do take a minute or two. It's just 3 short questions. So thank you very much. I'll let you multitask while we wrap up. I won't do an enforced silent survey completion period. But I just wanted to say thank you so much to all our panelists once more, to Teresa, to Maraki, to Sophie. Thank you, attendees. Thank you for taking part. Thanks to everyone who asked questions and engaged. We really appreciated having you here. And you look out for the follow-up resources. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a great rest of your Wednesday and week. Take care. Thank you.